So there were many things, of course, in Japanese culture in a more traditional sense. The design for efficient use of all resources, which predates the modern era and comes from a large population on limited islands, that before the resources coming from the around the world to support the modern form of Japan, that traditional form provided many examples of efficient ways to do things, and I think saw that in the Japanese permaculture networks, that there was this combination of new ecological ideas from other parts of the world, but also the rediscovery of those traditional aspects. And I think a lot of the food culture of making efficient use of all different sorts of plants. A very common one that we do here is cooking carrot tops, for example, whereas Australians, like, oh no, carrot tops are something you throw away. Many things of also recognising the value of wild foods that come from nature, whether it's mushrooms in the forest or special herbs, that in many places in the world those things are seen as, oh, that's what poor people ate, and we don't eat those now, or people ate those during the war, or there's the other view of it as this high status, very elite thing, like French truffles. In Japan, it seemed there was a more balanced understanding of the value of wild things, of ordinary things, that sort of kept those things in balance. And also a lot of the use of wood and the architectural design and getting the maximum value from wood, and combining wood with skill to how to produce structures that are durable. There's a great influence there. There's been an influence to the West through architecture. So a lot of those traditional examples, but then there's also modern examples that when we were in Japan, the what we call community supported agriculture and is it teike systems of consumers connecting to farmers to get their food. These examples were sort of more or less taken for granted or being explained to us. And I was saying, this is like really a very important Japanese contribution of modern environmental thinking, and like I was very interested to see how did this evolve in Japan earlier, because it then influenced the development of those systems in the United States and then later here. This connection between people in the city and the countryside. And so that I think is an example of a modern idea that emerged in Japan in the post-war period, that is now spreading around the world as contributing. So both, there are ideas in the tradition that we are learn from, and certainly here there's a lot of things in the way we grow things through to sleeping on a futon that we roll up on the floor. So we do things personally, not necessarily like average Australians, but a lot of things that are influenced by Japan. And when we were in Japan, sometimes people said, "Oh, you use chopsticks very well." I said, "Yeah, I've been using chopsticks since I was 10 years old." And they're saying, "This is Japanese radish." And I said, "Yeah, we grow daikon." So I got the impression that in Japan people were so aware of the huge influence of the West on Japan that had overshadowed people's understanding of how much Japan has influenced the rest of the world. And so there are many things that I think even also the management of plants, even in the forms that are the extreme art forms like bonsai, whatever, but the more careful management of vegetation, instead of living in a complete jungle where you have plants pruned and trained to provide wind buffering but air moving through to buildings, that management of plants in that careful way is in landscape design. Some of it as an aesthetic, but always with a sort of a functional role behind it. We've learned a lot from those systems as well. So I think the other aspect, I think, is that before I went to Japan, Italy was the reference for me of a modern, affluent, industrialised country that had still retained quite a lot of its traditional food culture and ways of living and organising that were useful to learn from a permaculture point of view, because a lot of that learning of those traditional systems is from poor countries where those systems are still intact. Whereas Italy always seemed to me as a place where, those things had persisted to a degree and there was a lot to learn. But when I went to Japan, I felt, no, Japan has even more of that retention, even if it was partly a divide between the countryside and the city, but that it still exists. And there's all sorts of historical and cultural reasons of why that might have been the case, but that is like a resource pool, a wellspring for the things we need to develop in the future. Not necessarily exactly the same as people traditionally did, but that can be adapted. And so one example of that was when I was in rural Japan. I was shown the coppiced mulberry bushes that were a part of the common landscape for silk production that is now very rare. And I was talking to people about the role of animals in the landscape, which is not so familiar in Japan. Animals are contained in pens, and I was talking about how goats could be useful in the forests behind villages, and how in the dry season in winter could be eating stubbles on rice paddies. And then I was explaining that these mulberry maintained as tree fodder systems to feed goats. So hybridizing the ways we do things here with elements of tradition that are no longer being maintained, that maybe that silk production is no longer there, but there's still a role for those vegetation systems that could be combined. And I think those creative ways for ideas from other places and tradition, there's a lot of potential, but also I saw the other side of the tendency of tradition, and this is the way something is done, also acts as a block against things. So in the same way that the modern industrial world hasn't swept away all those traditional things, there's that other side of dogged traditional resistance that is especially a characteristic, you could say, of old people. So there's always, the positive and the negative in these things.